The global trade barometer has turned red. Brussels and Ottawa pressed these curtain button at the same time, and President Trump's 30% additional tariffs now face a $150 billion steel and concrete front. Europe's new list targets 90 items ranging from Boeing to bourbon, while Canada's target supply chains ranging from Detroit sheet metal to Alabama aluminum. So, will Washington back down, or will it raise the wall and lock its own industrialists in? Now, we will examine in detail the response of Trump's 30% tariff and the retaliation time length, European Union and Canada to the newest tariffs, and how much damage this response will cause to the US economy. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like our videos to stay up to date with our content. On the July morning, as the wind picked upon the Atlantic coast, an invisible power line stretched from the bell towers of Brussels to the marble corridors of Washington. The European Commission leaked a one-sentence note from its steel door which resembled a diver's door. The Union's first-phase customs response would not be limited to a list worth $24.5 billion, but would be completed with a much broader SALVOEU's second tariff list, Boeing to bourbon reaching the $90 billion mark. To put that figure in perspective, it was pronounced as $72 billion. At today's exchange rate, this corresponds to $84 billion, creating a crossfire scenario worth a total of $108.5 billion with the first step. Brussels merely said that the approval process will be completed in the Commission's Trade Policy Committee, but everyone knew that this was more of a countdown than a diplomatic waiting room. While Washington was still busy clearing the smoke from Trump's 30% tariff declaration, the EU left only a few clues about the details of this list. The list included Boeing passenger aircraft and their spare fuselage panels, Honeywell branded. Brussels $84 billion countermeasure strategy AVX packages, SUVs from the Detroit assembly line, California meat processing machines, and agricultural items ranging from Kansas wheat to bourbon and rum. Almost as a symbolic, bourbon and rum were added to the middle of the list because the Commission wanted to make it clear that its strategy was not only aimed at the high-tech backbone, but also at the agriculture and beverage lobby exclamoring. In the corridors of the Senate, the list is still on the table, but as soon as it is approved, exporters will face a shock wave of up to 35% at port gates and in leasing contracts. The real message of this second dose was not just dollars and calculations. The EU was Canada's $40 billion retaliation draft explained Trump, as you build higher walls, we will build higher towers. The initial response of $24.5 billion was set as the lower limit of the proportionality principle after lengthy discussions in Brussels. But as Trump rhetoric became more aggressive, Berlin, Paris, and Rome returned to the negotiating table, and a side list of aircraft fuselages, automobiles, electronic components, and chemicals was added to the main list like a Johnshadow. Behind closed doors, the talk is that if the US Congress does not withdraw the tariffs under internal pressure, the EU will bring a third phase to the agenda and raise the target amount to $135 billion. In other words, aviation sector under siege, Boeing and Honeywell at risk. Union's plan is to respond to each rising floor of the wall with an even bigger concrete block. At the same time, a different but complementary move is being prepared in the northern orbit. Just 48 hours after Ottawa announced that it was setting a ceiling of $15.66 billion on its first steel and aluminum rotation against Washington, a second draft package was released to the press. This draft includes items ranging from automotive to heavy machinery, household appliances to sub-assembly components with a total value of nearly $40 billion, Canada's finance minister said at the microphone. Plan B is ready. If the US wall is permanent, we will make Decker Rider permanent. The toughest item on Ottawa's Detroit's automotive pain points rotation list is the trigger mechanism. If steel and aluminum imports exceed the defined quota, the tax rate will jump to 50%. This means an additional burden of $400 to $500 Canadian per ton of American steel. Febersol's Ottawa duo has thus closed the field with a giant circle to squeeze Trump's trade war from both sides. Crossfire amounting to $108.5 billion from Europe and $40 billion from Canada for a total of $150 billion. To grasp the magnitude of the figure, only Ottawa's trigger tax on steel and quota fallout need only look at the previous pages of the global trade ledger. The 2018 steel crisis hit the parties with blows of $20 to $30 billion. Tensions first fermented, then subsided, but now the house is huge and the walls are made of fire. Even the WTO's passive people's body is still limping. In other words, with the mediation body effectively shelved, the only way to pierce the armor of customs is through open retaliation. On the ground, on Washington's side, heads are spinning. Production-centered states want to see Trump's wall as an employment protection shield. But the Capitol backbone is saying something else. In Seattle, Boeing's boardroom knows that if carbon tax factor, EU's green advantage, Europe's 35% tariff comes into effect, the order queue will melt away with just a few moves. Aircraft leasing is done in Dublin, maintenance in the Hamburg-Lundberg corridor, and spare parts are restored in Amsterdam. A tariff wave carries the risk of shifting the entire corridor in favor of Airbus. Anthony Wells' Arizona campus, 1,500 software engineers are whispering that European avionics are already close in price performance. A tax shock would be the final blow. Tens of thousands of indirect jobs are flooding the Senate's mailbox with letters. The parties are not only clashing on the aviation front, the automotive chain in the heart of Detroit is also in a state of panic. THEU's second tariff specifically targets global supply chain shifts and investment realignment tech SUVs, pickups, and the luxury internal combustion segment. If it goes to the third phase, the additional tax rate will be 20%. However, Europe's main alternative in that segment is already platforms produced on its own continent and to a lesser extent, South Korea. When the US manufacturers' euro-denominated costs rise, European dealers can renew their supply plans overnight. This means a narrowing of the export window for the Detroit Valley. At the same time, Canada's Retaliation is narrowing the Michigan-Ontario supply tunnel on the sheet metal and angle block front. As a result, the American automotive chain is feeling market pressure from both the north and the east: chemicals, agriculture, electronic circuits. Each of the items scattered across the EU's list tickles a different paralysis and the logic of unregulated retaliation lobby in US domestic politics. Oil giants returning home from the Middle East are feeling the effects of Rotterdam's barrel quota on everything from Boeing engine oil to corn. Wisconsin corn farmers are worried that Europe's bourbon tax will bring back the losses they suffered in 2019. A Texas rum brand is whispering fears of losing the Caribbean market. Florida's citrus growers are checking to see if their names have been removed from the fruit and vegetable list. As the list grows, Washington's coalition map is cracking. In Canada, the situation is slightly different. Ottawa isn't building a wall, but there's a 50% shock wave lurking under the ceiling. That's a real red line for US suppliers. Warehouses in Washington's fractured lobby map. Industry pushback. City of Windsor tried to stockpile American steel and move it cannot it be for the ceiling announcement. Federal Customs called this move artificial stockpiling and introduced options remain for 3 months. Either new steel investments will be made in Canada, suppliers such as Australia, South Korea, and Brazil will step in. Both options mean a significant loss of market share for the US. When Prime Minister Carney said that Canadian tariffs were not a long-term bargaining chip and would become part of Canada's green aluminum boom permanent national industrial fabric, if Washington did not back down, the classic cycle changed on. The Ottawa-Toronto financial line. Banks opened credit lines for steel and low-carbon aluminum projects. Thanks to Quebec's hydroelectric power, aluminum's carbon footprint was already at a quarter off level. Now European buyers will purchase Canadian-signed ingots with green credentials. America's tariff wall is returning as a clean passport for Canadian aluminum and extra cost for use aluminum. Europe is moving with similar parameters, with the carbon border adjustment mechanism set to come into full force in 2026. Engines, machinery, and electronic pens on the EU tax list. Political repercussions. US Senate and internal backlash will not only incur customs costs, but also additional fees if their carbon score is high. Thus, American exporters will be hit with a double whammy of tariffs plus carbon, while their European competitors will be able to wear the domestic low-emission badge on their chests. The winners and losers of tariff war are even taking shape. In the environmental arena, of course, Washington is threatening to take the matter to the WTO, but the appellate body is still blocked. The tariff retaliation spiral is based on the logic of if there is no referee, let's continue the duel. The U.S. Trade Representative Office has already sent its initial response to Brussels. The EU's list is disproportionate. Airlines' future scenarios. Will EU trigger third-phase tariffs? And the agricultural supply chain cannot be targeted. The Brussels spokesperson rests with a single sentence: proportionality is not about the size of tax to be imposed, but about balancing the damage caused. While fewer of words continues, the Canadian press is hyping Carney's permanent exit, and the EU media is running headlines in huge fonts about a second dose of 84 billion. Amid all this, American voters are left to grapple with rising shelf prices and uncertain industrial shifts. What will happen if things get worse? Analysts predict that the meltdown in Boeing's European order book could reach will collapse the wall first. Lobby versus White House $110 billion in 5 years, and Honeywell's R&D budget could shrink by $2 billion a year. The market share of SUVs from Detroit could fall from 18% to less than 7% in Europe. Similarly, the decline in Alabama-Kentucky Wisey's share of U-shells will also hit Tennessee's corn supply. On the other side, the shift of Canadian aluminum to Europe, Brazilian sheet metal to Canada, and South Korean electronic steel to the EU is redrawing global trade routes. This picture represents a huge homework assignment that blends trade maps with climate transition. If steel and aluminum recycling rates increase in Canada, hydroelectricity and hydrogen come into play, and investment in electric steel furnaces accelerates in the EU, the US may have to finance its competitors with environmental parts. While building its wall, Trump's protectionist slogan may give domestic producers a sense of security in the short term. But in the long run, it creates disadvantages in the cost-environmental and trade routes intertwined technological carbon triangle. Now the whole world is watching to see where the first serious internal blow to Trump's will come from. Will it be Thesanates, Farmer Corridor, the Seattle, Arizona aviation lobby, the Michigan, Ohio automotive chain, or the Kentucky Tennessee whiskey barons who raised the first loud voice? The answer to this question will also determine whether Brussels will put the third phase list in the table and whether Ottawa will publish the $40 billion package in the official gazette. Behind closed doors, pens are clicking, manifestos are being gupted, and container codes are being matched with new customs closing thoughts and call to action classifications. In short, this is not a Kant's collision, but a planned layer red trade maneuver with mutual lesson notes. On opposite sides of the Atlantic, industrial giants, laboratory technicians, union representatives, senators, and brokers are breathing in unison. But at different tempos, America's tariffs have fueled Europe and Canada's complex crossfire choreography. Now, no one can predict when the curtain will fall. The only certainty is that when the curtain falls, the landscape will be vastly different from today. Single quotes as dot with newly drawn blue-red customs lines blending into carbon green, digital signatures, and positive-negative tax rates. When the fog lifts from thicker riders, the familiar paths of global trade may flow in entirely new directions. What are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your opinions in the comments section. To stay updated in new videos, please subscribe to our channel and enable notifications.